A century after the United States established an American-style democracy in the Philippines, parang napaka-similar yung ating mga presidente. President Donald Trump and President Rodrigo Duterte have constantly been compared around the world as right-wing populists with very similar demeanor and predisposition towards politics. And yet, kahit napaka-similar yung dalawang presidente natin, the two heads of state are operating in very different institutional contexts. One way to understand it is to look at the tale of two Supreme Courts. Amazingly, over the past few months, the US Supreme Court, supposedly a conservative-dominated Supreme Court with two of President Trump's appointees there, has handed one defeat after another to the US president. In contrast, it has been a clean sweep for President Duterte here in the Philippines. The independent Philippine Supreme Court has more or less sided with President Duterte on every single major Supreme Court ruling over the past few years. For critics, that raises serious concerns about rule of law and proper checks and balances and separation of powers in the Philippines, while for some, Donald Trump's one defeat after another in a supposedly conservative-dominated Supreme Court shows that the US democracy and its institutional checks and balances are still robust and very much alive. Now, there are two important institutional differences between the Philippine Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court. Unang-una, sa Amerika, wala pong mandatory retirement age of around 70 for the justices. In fact, a lot of US justices have stayed as long as they could until some of them in fact died while in office. In the Philippines, in contrast, you have a mandatory age of retirement for our Supreme Court justices. Kaya every other year, maraming bagong Supreme Court justices ay na-appoint. President Arroyo appointed up to 14 out of 15 justices during her tenure in office, which lasted almost a decade. President Duterte, in a significantly shorter period of time, is expected to appoint up to 13 out of 15 justices in the Philippine Supreme Court. But a second and even more important distinction between the Philippines and the United States Supreme Court is that pagdating sa US, the justices' appointment will go through a very rigorous scrutiny and a series of hearings, sometimes very contentious hearings, as we saw in the case of Justice Kavanaugh in the US Senate. But in the Philippines, the appointees of the presidents will not have to go through such level of legislative scrutiny. So perhaps this could partly explain the huge divergence in terms of the rulings in Supreme Court of the United States and in the Philippines, or at least that's what your critics will say. Over the past few months, President Trump's conservative agenda suffered one defeat after another in the US Supreme Court. And most recently, natalo si Donald Trump on a very crucial and very personal issue, and that's opening up of his tax returns and personal finances. In a huge setback for President Trump, even two of his own appointees sided with the majority against the request of the Trump administration to have significant amount of secrecy on the president's private financial transactions and records. Now contrast that, for instance, to Supreme Court's recent decision to junk a petition for greater transparency on the part of President Duterte when it comes to his health. Now, wag natin kalimutan, sa ating saligang batas, the 1987 Constitution, there are very clear stipulations in terms of the importance of knowledge about the health of the president and the head of state. And this was born out of our bitter and very difficult experience during the martial law period when President Marcos was ill for a very long time, and that was kept secret from much of the country. It was precisely the president's long absences that led to this petition by lawyer Dina De Leon to ask the Supreme Court to require the government to have more transparency on the president's health condition. In fact, President Duterte himself, in an interview last year with GMA Network, ito yung sinabi niya. At kung sabihin mong may sakit ako, meron. You name it. I have it. Lahat ng sakit nandito na sa akin kasi matanda na ako. On multiple occasions, the president even suggested that he may have autoimmune disease and other kinds of ailments and conditions. So that's why certain concerned citizens asked for greater transparency on this issue. But the Supreme Court junked the petition right off the bat. Now, the junking of the petition for greater transparency on President Duterte's health conditions is just one of many Supreme Court victory for the President of the Philippines. Kasama dyan is the controversial burial of the former President and Dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Kasama din dyan yung years-long martial law in Mindanao. Not to mention the quo warranto ouster of former Chief Justice Sereno, which a lot of top experts would say was unconstitutional. So here we are, two democracies, two quite similar presidents, but very different outcomes for them when it comes to top and major Supreme Court rulings. Ako po si Richard Hidarian. Stand with us, stand for truth.